The following program is a presentation of the Civil War Broadcasting Network. It's one of a series of programs wherein General Grant lifts up a person, place, or event or events in the war for review and reflection. It is available on the free YouTube channel Dr. E.C. Fields, on Facebook under Kurt Fields as General Ulysses S. Grant, and other social media. Permission to copy and distribute is granted and indeed encouraged. Remember, you are the future of our past. Tonight's program is the first of a series of three dealing with the political and humanitarian aspects of what to do with runaway slaves. Indeed, what were we to call them? This segment of the series is Contrabands. What are we to do with them? I am Major General Ulysses S. Grant, and you join me in my camp at Grand Junction, Tennessee. Grand Junction is a town on the Memphis and Charleston Railroad, about 60 miles due east of Memphis, and it sprawls on both sides of the Memphis and Charleston, as does my camp. It's fall of '62, and I am giving serious thought to moving upon Vicksburg, going down the Mississippi Central Railroad, and taking Jackson, then wheeling to the right to the west to take Vicksburg. But I'm having to grapple with the serious problem of hundreds of contrabands, as we now call runaway slaves or escaped slaves. And this has been an ongoing problem that goes back to 1850. Now, I'm going to appoint Chaplain John Eaton of the 27th Ohio Volunteers, their chaplain, to be the administrator for contrabands here at this camp in Grand Junction, Tennessee, and the camp in Corinth, Mississippi, which is presently under the direction of General Grenville Dodge. But this goes back, as I said, to the Compromise of 1850, the Runaway Slave Act, the Fugitive Slave Act, which said that slaves had to be returned to their masters or to slave catcher or hunters as they were presented to a federal commissioner. That is to be addressed, I shall address that at length in another reflection with you. But suffice to say, for the purposes of this coming together, that the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, when the war started, was still on the books. It was the law of the land. The states have seceded from the Union, and President Lincoln is dancing a legal jig between the law of the land, return slaves, not wanting to return slaves, but not wanting to offend loyal to the Union slave owners. For example, there were many in Washington City as I speak, and driving those folks into the arms of the Confederacy. So, law of the land, don't return slaves, political, humanitarian, and you can see why it became so quickly such a dilemma of the magnitude it did. In May of '61, a political general, Benjamin F. Butler of Massachusetts, statesman and quite an attorney by profession, he gave credibility to the term contrabands. Now, it wasn't the first time it had been used. A naval vessel sometime prior to that had used the word contrabands in their logbook on a report of an escaping black. And David Hunter in, I think, South Carolina had used it. General John C. Fremont had used it. But General Butler articulated the idea of contrabands, defined them in an acceptably, in fact, indeed embraced legal cloaking, and gave the president an out to not return slaves, and gave us in the field, who are receiving daily scores, if not hundreds, of slaves who have either run away or their owners have run away and abandoned them. We had to have some way to deal with this between the law and humanitarian purposes and thinking. And they're flooding into, contrabands are flooding into our camps. General Butler, a political appointee, was at Fortress Monroe near Washington City, building emplacements under fire from rebel forces across the river, and came to, I think, make a cogent statement. But I should like to review with you the process that he started, that he articulated, so that you may understand specifically what was said and the import of it, because it has import that will go into perhaps at some time blacks are going to be able to become soldiers and become United States Army. That could happen. There's no end to the ramifications of what General Butler articulated as contrabands, and indeed what I'm going to do with Chaplain Eaton, John Eaton, here in Grand Junction, Tennessee, was taking over officially a title of dealing with contrabands. But on May 25th of 61, Major General Butler wrote to Lieutenant General Winfield Scott, Saturday, May 25th. I had written thus far when I was called away to meet Major Carey of the active Virginia Volunteers upon questions which have arisen of very considerable importance, both in a military and political aspect, and which I beg leave to submit herewith. On Thursday night, 3 Negroes, field hands belonging to Colonel Charles K. Mallory, now in command of the secession forces in this district, delivered themselves up to my picket guard, and as I learned from the report of the officer of the guard in the morning, had been detained by him. I immediately gave personal attention to the matter and found satisfactory evidence that these men were about to be taken to Carolina for the purpose of aiding the secession forces there. That 2 of them left wives and children here. 1 of them was a free woman. That the other had left his master from fear that he would be called upon to take part in the rebel armies. Now, I should like to interject here at this point and say those 3 men were named Frank Baker, Shepard Mallory, and James Townsend. Frank Baker, Shepard Mallory, and James Townsend. Those 3 men, it could be said, are the nucleus for what ultimately became the contraband policy, for it was those 3 men, Frank Baker, Shepard Mallory, and James Townsend, upon which General Butler began to define the policy of contrabands and submitting his suggestions of how to deal with that issue. All right. Satisfied of these facts, from cautious examination of each of the Negroes apart from the others, I determined for the present, and until better advised, as these men were very serviceable, and I had great need of labor in my quartermaster's department, to avail myself of their services, and that I would send a receipt to Colonel Mallory that I had so taken them as I would for any other property of a private citizen, which the exigencies of the service seemed to require to be taken by me, and especially property that was designed, adapted, and about to be used against the United States. As this is but an individual instance in a course of policy which may be required to be pursued with regard to this species of property, I have detailed to the Lieutenant General this case and asked his direction. I am credibly informed that the Negroes in this neighborhood are now being employed in the erection of batteries and other works by the rebels, which it would be nearly or quite impossible to construct without their labor. Shall they be allowed the use of this property against the United States, and we not be allowed to use its use in the aid of the United States? Major Carey demanded to know, with regard to the Negroes, what course I intended to pursue. I answered him substantially as I have written above, when he desired to know if I did not feel myself bound by my constitutional obligations to deliver up fugitives under the Fugitive Slave Act. To this I replied that the Fugitive Slave Act did not affect a foreign country, which Virginia claimed to be, and that she must reckon it one of the infelicities of her position that in so far at least she was taken at her word, that in Maryland, a loyal state, fugitives from service had been returned, and that even now, although so much pressed by my necessities for the use of these men of Colonel Mallory's, yet if their master would come in to the fort and take the oath of allegiance to the Constitution of the United States, I would deliver the men up to him and endeavor to hire their services of him if he desired to part with them. To this, Major Carey responded that Colonel Mallory was absent. Trusting that these dispositions and movements will meet the approval of the Lieutenant General, and begging pardon for the detailed length of this dispatch, I have the honor to be, etc., Benjamin F. Butler, Major General Commanding. So on May 23rd, Frank Baker, Shepard Mallory, and James Townsend become the focal point of slaves coming into federal facilities for protection. And on Saturday, General Butler begins to formulate on paper officially his suggestions about a potential policy. And then the next letter that is written 2 days later, May 27th, General Butler writes to Lieutenant General Scott. Since my last dispatch, the question in regard to slave property is becoming one of very serious magnitude. The inhabitants of Virginia are using their Negroes in the batteries and are preparing to send the women and children south. The escapes from them are very numerous, and a squad has come in this morning to my pickets bringing their women and children. Of course, these cannot be dealt with upon the theory on which I designed to treat the services of able-bodied men and women who might come within my lines, and of which I gave you a detailed account in my last dispatch. I am in the utmost doubt what to do with this species of property. Up to this time, I have had come within my lines men and women with their children, entire families, each family belonging to the same owner. I have therefore determined to employ, as I can do very profitably, the able-bodied persons in the party, issuing proper food for the support of all, and charging against their services the expense of care and sustenance of the non-laborers, keeping a strict and accurate account as well of the services as of the expenditure, having the worth of the services and the cost of the expenditure determined by a board of survey hereafter to be detailed. I know of no other manner in which to dispose of this subject and the questions connected therewith. As a matter of property to the insurgents, it will be a very great moment. The number that I now have amounting, as I am informed, to what in good times would be of the value of $60,000. 12 of these Negroes, I am informed, have escaped from the erection of the batteries on Sewell's Point, which this morning fired upon my expedition as it passed by out of range. As a means of offense, therefore, in the enemy's hands, these Negroes, when able-bodied, are of the last importance. Without them, the batteries could not have been erected, at least for many weeks. As a military question, it would seem to be a measure of necessity to deprive their masters of their services. How can this be done? As a political question and a question of humanity, can I receive the services of a father and a mother and not take their children? Of the humanitarian aspect, I have no doubt. Of the political one, I have no right to judge. I therefore submit all this to your better judgment, and as these questions have a political aspect, I have ventured, and I trust I am not wrong in so doing, to duplicate the parts of my dispatch relating to this subject and forward them to the Secretary of War. He did so, and on May the 30th, Secretary of War Simon Cameron came into the situation. Washington, May 30th, 1861. Major General Butler. Sir, your action in respect to the Negroes who came in your lines from the service of the rebels is approved. The department is sensible of the embarrassment which must surround officers conducting military operations in a state by the laws of which slavery is sanctioned. The government cannot recognize the rejection by any state of its federal obligations, nor can it refuse the performance of the federal obligations resting upon itself. Among these federal obligations, however, none can be more important than that of suppressing and dispersing armed combinations for the purpose of overthrowing its whole constitutional authority. While therefore you will permit no interference by the persons under your command with the relations of persons held to service under the laws of any state, you will, on the other hand, so long as any state within which your military operations are conducted is under the control of such armed combinations, refrain from surrendering to alleged masters any persons who may come within your lines. You will employ such persons in the service to which they may be best adapted, keeping an account of the labor by them performed, of the value of it, and of the expense of their maintenance. The question of their final disposition will be reserved for future determination. Simon Cameron, Secretary of War. The policy, though, becomes articulated very well in the letter from General Butler on July 30th of 1861. So we've gone from May 25th and 6th, May 27th, into June from the Secretary of War. But on July 30th, General Butler wrote to Simon Cameron, Sir, and this is a part of the letter that deals with this issue of the contrabands. In the village of Hampton, there were a large number of Negroes, composed in a great measure of women and children of the men who had fled thither within my lines for protection, who had escaped from marauding parties of rebels, who had been gathering up able-bodied blacks to aid them in constructing their batteries on the James and York rivers. I had employed the men in Hampton in throwing up entrenchments, and they were working zealously and efficiently at that duty, saving our soldiers from that labor under the gleam of the midday sun. The women were earning substantially their own subsistence in washing, marketing, and taking care of the clothes of the soldiers, and rations were being served out to the men who worked for the support of the children. But by the evacuation of Hampton, rendered necessary by the withdrawal of troops, leaving me scarcely 5,000 men outside the fort, including the force at Newport News, all these black people were obliged to break up their homes at Hampton, fleeing across the creek within my lines for protection and support. Indeed, it was a most distressing sight to see these poor creatures who had trusted to the protection of the arms of the United States and who aided the troops of the United States in their enterprise to be thus obliged to flee from their homes and the homes of their masters who had deserted them and become fugitives from fear of the return of the rebel soldiery who had threatened to shoot the men who had wrought for us and to carry off the women who had served us to a worse than Egyptian bondage. I have therefore now within the peninsula, this side of Hampton Creek, 900 Negroes, 300 of whom are able-bodied men, 30 of whom are men substantially past hard labor, 175 women, 225 children under the age of 10 years, and 170 between 10 and 18 years, and many more coming in. The questions which this state of facts present are very embarrassing. First, what shall be done with them? And second, what is their state and condition? Upon these questions, I desire the instructions of the department. The first question, however, may perhaps be answered by considering the last. Are these men, women, and children slaves? Are they free? Is their condition that of men, women, and children, or of property? Or is it a mixed relation? What their status was under the Constitution and laws, we all know. What has been the effect of a rebellion and a state of war upon that status? When I adopted the theory of treating the able-bodied Negro fit to work in the trenches as property liable to be used in aid of rebellion, and so contraband of war, that condition of things was insofar met, as I then and still believe, on a legal and constitutional basis. But now a new series of questions arise. Passing by women, the children certainly cannot be treated on that basis. If property, they must be considered the encumbrance rather than the auxiliary of an army. And of course, in no possible legal relation could be treated as contraband. Are they property? If they were so, they would have been left by their they had been left by their masters and owners, deserted, thrown away, abandoned, like the wrecked vessel upon the ocean. Their former possessors and owners have causelessly, traitorously, rebelliously, and to carry out the figure, practically abandoned them to be swallowed up by the winter storm of starvation. If property, do they not become the property of salvors? But we, their salvors, do not need and will not hold such property, and will assume that no such ownership. Has not therefore all proprietary relation ceased? Have they not become thereupon men, women, and children, no longer under the ownership of any kind, the fearful relics of fugitive masters? Have they not by their masters' acts and the state of war assumed the condition which we hold to be the normal one of those made in God's image? Is not every constitutional, legal, and normal requirement as well to the runaway master as their relinquished slaves thus answered? I confess that my own mind is compelled by this reasoning to look upon them as men and women, if not free-born, yet free, manumitted, sent forth from the hand that held them, never to be reclaimed. Of course, if this reasoning, thus imperfectly set forth, is correct, my duty as a humane man is very plain. I should take the same care of these men, women, and children, houseless, homeless, and unprovided for, as I would of the same number of men, women, and children who, for their attachment to the Union, had been driven or allowed to flee from the Confederate States. I should have no doubt on this question had I not seen it stated that an order had been issued by General McDowell in his department substantially forbidding all fugitive slaves from coming within his lines or being harbored there. Is that order to be enforced in all military departments? If so, who are to be considered fugitive whose master runs away and leaves him? Is it forbidden to the troops to aid or harbor within their lines the Negro children who are found therein? Or is the soldier, when his march has destroyed their means of subsistence, to allow them to starve because he has driven off the rebel masters? Now, shall the commander of a regiment or battalion sit in judgment of the question? Whether any given black man has fled from his master or his master fled from him? Indeed, how are the freeborn to be distinguished? Is one any more or less a fugitive slave because he has labored upon the rebel entrenchments? If he has so labored, if I understand it, he is to be harbored, by the reception of which are the rebels most to be distressed, by taking those who have brought all their rebel masters desired, masked their battery, or those who have refused to labor and left the battery unmasked. I have very decided opinions upon the subject of this order. It does not become me to criticize it, and I write in no spirit of criticism, but simply to explain the full difficulties that surround the enforcing it. If the enforcement of that order becomes the policy of the government, I, as a soldier, shall be bound to enforce it steadfastly, if not cheerfully. But if left to my own discretion, as you may have gathered from my reasoning, I should take a widely different course from that which it indicates. In a loyal state, I would put down a servile insurrection. In a state of rebellion, I would confiscate that which was used to oppose my arms, and take all of that property which constituted the wealth of that state, and furnish the means by which the war is prosecuted, besides being the cause of the war, and if in so doing it should be objected that human beings were brought to the free enjoyment of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, such objection might not require much consideration. Pardon me for addressing the Secretary of War directly upon the question, as it involves some political consideration as well as the propriety of military action. Benjamin F. Butler, Major General Commanding. So that letter articulates and defines the contraband or contrabands of war. If the slave was used in the employ of a rebel master and he escapes to our lines, then we should be able to put him to work. If the master runs away and abandons the slave, if he was disloyal to the Union, we should be able to use the slave. And the humanitarian issue, we can't turn these people away and leave them to the whims of fortune or the rebels if they come back. But by declaring them contrabands of war, it got around the Fugitive Slave Act requirements. It became legal to keep them and employ them. It became known as has become known as the Fortress Monroe Doctrine, which I should hasten to point out is something of a tongue-in-cheek. Of course, the Monroe Doctrine comes to mind. This is a play on that, and since General Butler was at Fortress Monroe, it was termed by the journalists the Fortress Monroe Doctrine, and has carried that either stigma or reputation since then. Now, more than a year later, in the fall of '62, things have changed significantly as far as how we work with contrabands and the legalities of the laws and so forth around escaping slaves. And we have got a number of contraband camps. I have a number of them in this area, one in Corinth and one here in Grand Junction. Their numbers have grown to such that there must be somebody to take charge. We are feeding and clothing them as best we can. We are employing them, paying them. I'm having them harvest cotton that was still in the field and corn that ready to be harvested that was still in the field, and they're being paid wages, some 50 cents an hour. If they work for example, the women who stayed while their husbands went off to war or escaped, they're being required to pay their former slaves who are working that land. Now they're working them as free people, and they're being paid for the first time in their lives. But the issue has grown to the point in numbers that they must be dealt with in an organized manner. I've got an army and a war to win. I am not a social agency, but I cannot, the humanitarian issue, turn a blind eye to their plight and their needs. So I am appointing Chaplain John Eaton of the 27th Ohio Volunteers. He doesn't know it yet, but he's going to very shortly be advised of that, and I'm going to call him for a meeting with me. In our next coming together, I will talk about my meeting with Chaplain Eaton and the development of our relationship and the development of what he will do with the contrabands and how we progress from there. So this has been Contrabands. What are we to do with them? The next segment is going to be Contrabands of War. What are we doing with them? So for the moment, I must bring my recollection to an end and be about my business. And until we come together again to reflect, I bid you adieu.